I'm recording now. Okay, I'm Marcus. I'm going to talk about, as more for the audience, talk about how to contribute documentation in Gutenberg. And I'm going to walk through, I posted a link in the chat, and wherever I post this video, I'll include the link to it. And it has the outline of kind of what I'm going to walk through. And the discussion is just going to be how to contribute documentation to Gutenberg, but the main focus is going to be probably on the GitHub, on the contribution part, and not necessarily the documentation part. So it'll be how do you go through the GitHub PR process, and how do you manage actually getting the submission in. And I'll briefly touch on some other pieces of it. Let me share my screen. Let's just share the whole screen. And can everyone see it? Thumbs up, all right. All right, and so the did my audio stop? Okay, it's working. Oh, that's weird. So it's working. Okay, that was strange. It auto muted me somehow. I might have clicked the button wrong. So GitHub, WordPress, Gutenberg, and under documentation, there's a label documentation, and that will sort all the open documentation issues. And you can find anything in there. If you're looking for an issue, or if you saw an issue that you want to update, you can find them all in there. If you're going to work on one, it's usually best to create a new issue, talk about what you're going to work on, and then we'll walk through the kind of the PR process on how you would submit that. So that's finding an issue. The other kind of aspect you want to look at is the, there's a contribution guide, which you can find in the block editor handbook. So if you go to developer.wordpress.org, the block editor handbook is here. Hey, Milana. I'm just getting started too, so welcome.
Hi.
Hello.
Sorry for being late.
No problem, no problem.
Oh, you're recording. Cool.
I am recording now too, so it's fine. It's a casual affair. So in the block editor handbook, there is a contributor guide, and there is a documentation section also for that. This kind of walks through some of what I'm talking about today too, so you can look through that. It talks about how to update documents, create documents. This is goes a little bit briefer through it, and I'll talk probably a little more in detail on these pieces. And then I'll also look, after this session, I'll look back at what notes I have, any questions that come in, and I can update some of the documentation also and make sure that everything's right. One of the important things to also look at is, I have a link. And Milana, I also, in the chat window for the, for this Zoom, I posted this link, which is the kind of the outline of what I'm walking through right now. And so it's me the outline for the day too. So in the main WordPress documentation handbook, there's lots of useful resources. So you probably want to look through here just to get a sense of how to contribute documentation to overall WordPress, and kind of the interesting parts, like the Gutenberg project follows the same guides for grammar, the same guides for tone and voice, and all those aspects of it. They just get published in a slightly different way. So it's worth reviewing. I won't go too much into, like, I'll assume like what you're going to write is the fine part, and the contribution part's going to be the aspect of what I'll end up covering, not the actual how do I document something, if that makes sense. Not the details of what you're documenting or what you're typing in, but the details of how do you submit what you want to submit. Okay, any initial questions on defining the issues? Or kind of this is just kind of the basics of, okay, let's say you were browsing through Gutenberg or you had something you wanted to contribute. And I should take one more step back, I'm sorry. There's two types of documentation on Gutenberg, and one is, I'm gonna find the link, I'm sorry, in the contributor guide. One of the documentation is user documentation, and there's a whole other team for user documentation. User documentation is what we refer to as like an author and someone using Gutenberg. So someone who wants to, how do I insert an image? How do I edit gallery? How do I change whatever it is as you're authoring posts? And those would be under user documentation. There is a, that uses a completely separate process. What I'm going to be covering is the kind of developer documentation on how do you extend Gutenberg, how do you write plugins, how do you develop on Gutenberg itself. So this is more the developer docs than the user documentation. We need help with user documentation, and we welcome all of that. So there's a group in Slack, I think it's join the docs group and say you want to help with user documentation, and there's a lot of friendly, helpful people there who can guide you in the right direction for user documentation. All right, so in my contribution process, there's kind of three different ways you can contribute. It's all through GitHub. The first one is by far the easiest, and so that's contributing directly on GitHub, and I'll walk through each one of these. And then one is a fork and edit, and then adding a new file, and we'll talk about those. But first, let's do the very easiest one. You just use GitHub and you edit directly. So you need to create a GitHub account, navigate to the page you want to change. So I created a GitHub account, and I'm going to navigate to Gutenberg, and let's say it doesn't much matter what document, but I am going to say, like, I want to edit this document because I saw a typo. So in Gutenberg, I need to move this window. Hold on a second, let me see if I can, my video is blocking my screen. All right. That should be better. So all of the Gutenberg documentation is in the docs directory. So WordPress Gutenberg in the docs directory. And all of the documentation is stored in here. It's stored as markdown files. And then these get published to this documentation site. So what we see here on this page is the same documentation we see here. There's a process that runs once something gets committed in, it runs every 15 minutes and will publish out to the hosted site here. So if I saw this page, it's this file readme, and I wanted to make a change, you can just directly in GitHub, click edit, and I can make my change. Let's call it test. Doesn't much matter. And then down here, I would want to use, let's say I was fixing, you'd want to put in a comment, fixing typo, but really it's a test. And then you'd want to describe what it is, or if you had adding additional details, whatever it might be, you would put them in there, and then you would click propose change. So what GitHub is doing at this point, it will create a PR for you automatically. It will automatically create a fork of the Gutenberg repository, and it will create it in your own repository. So the way GitHub works is you push up a change to your local, you create what they call a fork, a copy of Gutenberg. You make a change to your copy, and then you push that change and say, hey, I'd like to make this change to kind of the main
You're muted for me, Marcus. I don't know if it's the same for others.
That is weird. That's
Yeah,
twice.
that's good. That's
I
good. Now,
think my headset has a mute button. Maybe I bumped that. Let me move this out of the way. I'm sorry. How long was I muted?
not too long.
Okay. 20 minutes.
but it was nice scrolling. Okay, I'll leave it out.
Okay. And so when I click the proposed change, it creates a copy of the Gutenberg repository into my own repository. So on GitHub, I now have a copy of Gutenberg. So if I go to, I created a demo account because my real account has a few more permissions. So it created a copy of Gutenberg in this, in my own account. And it says it's forked from WordPress. So I'll make my change there. And then a pull request says, take this change and submit it to the WordPress repository and ask them like, hey, I would like to make this change. Do you accept it? I need to keep my copy around until it gets accepted. Otherwise, it will be removed before. So I'm going to create a pull request. So this shows what the pull request is. I added this one word test. And when I click create pull request, it will have a form and you just fill it in. And there's a bunch of details. And this is creating the pull request on the WordPress repository. So, and it has the details from what my commit was. This is just a test. Please ignore. I'll delete later. I'm going to delete all this and fill in whenever you make a pull request. Look through the there's some templates and guides, so descriptions, has it been tested, and all those aspects. Look through and fill in as much as possible. How do you test it? And we're talking about documentation, so usually documentations, like usually how do you test is like confirm the documentation works as expected. But if there's any screenshots or if there's any, like if it's just a documentation change, you can also say this just updates whatever the docs are. And most of this is for code. So usually I delete almost all this, but I'll type in details in these sections on what the change is, why I changed it, and all those aspects. And then that's it. And create a pull request, and that will create your PR. And then on Gutenberg, you'll get a PR number up here. When you go to the top level Gutenberg repository, you can go to PR, and it will find up in here. If these kind of grow, you can sort it by your author. You'll be up front. You can say, okay, this is my PR request. A set of tests runs after each PR gets created. And so you need to make sure all the tests pass. For documentation, this is rarely that it'll break. And you can see if there is an issue there, you can also ask for help in either the docs channel, the code editor. There are details here, and I'll talk about one issue that might show up when you're adding a new file, but we'll get into that. People will get pinged on, there's like something called code owners, and so they will get pinged for new updates. I'm one of the people, so I get update on any docs. You can see the list too. So any docs update, I'll get a ping and says, hey, someone's made a doc update. Can you come take a look at it? So these are the, oh, maybe I'm only in one. I'm in the developer docs, not the top level. So if you want to get updated, get pinged on it, you can make a change to that file. And any questions on that? So then eventually someone will come through, they'll review it. One of these reviewers will review it, or you can ping someone if it hasn't gotten an update in a few days, give it people some chance. You feel free to either join the code editor meeting, the core editor meeting, or join the docs meeting and say, oh, I have this update here. Can someone take a look at it? And because some things will get missed too. I get lots of GitHub notifications, so things do like fall down the list. Once approved, the approver will also merge it. And then, so at this point, everything you need to do, unless they ask for changes, will be done. If you need to make a change, you can go back to that same change. So you would want to make the change though on your local copy. So to get back there, you would want to go to your fork of Gutenberg. You want to make it on the branch that you just made. Let's see if it's already in this one. Docs. See, this one doesn't have the test. I added test there because it's going to be in. I think I can do it from the pull request too, the link. So in here, I think I can still edit it and do suggestions, but I should be able to edit the file again. Edit file. And then I can make a change here. It was hidden on the, I don't know why it's hidden on this one. So I can go to the files changed in my pull request, and then edit file. Then second change, and then this will update on the same PR. So when you, I want to commit it to that same branch that I'm on. I don't want to create a new one. I don't want to start a new pull request. I just want to commit it to the one that exists. And so let's say someone asked for a change and I came back and made a second change. It will show, okay, you've done 2 commits. These are the comments on that. Kind of any questions for this first part? This covers some initial of the topics. Let me.
You're muted again.
Why is it doing that? That one I didn't hit it. The thing's face up. I did not know. There might be a key combination or something I'm doing. Maybe I won't use. That's so strange. I'm sorry about that. I noticed it this time though. I'm going to unplug my mouse to see if that's causing some, because usually I don't have a mouse plugged in. All right, we'll see what happens, but I apologize. Technical difficulties are a must for all demos. So any initial kind of questions on the...
Muted again. It's not mouse. It's not mouse. You're muted again.
That is so strange. I don't know what's happening. I've used this headphone so many times without problems. Weird. Okay. I'll try and persevere and see what's going on. I don't know why we're running into issues now. So the first one, contributing directly on GitHub. Navigate to the file you want, edit the change, propose the change. And most GitHub will do most of that stuff that you need to do behind the scenes. And it's actually quite nice that way. You don't have to worry too much about the branch or that. It will create the PR you need. And if there aren't additional changes, you really don't need to worry too much. So this is nice that there's just a simple, like a typo or something. It's really easy to fix by just going into the docs, see the typo, and then, you know, just make that edit right there on GitHub. Just use the edit button, make the change, and then submit it, and it works really nicely. All right, the second process is, let's go to my outline, is doing the same thing, but instead of having GitHub manage the PRs, you manage it all locally. And to do this, you need to have Git installed and a text editor to edit. To install Git, you can go to, if you just do a search for Git, I'll find it. I think it's a Git, I don't even know what it is. I think it's Git SCM, yeah, gitscm.com. You can download it. I'm using Windows right now, so you can download it on Windows. It's available everywhere. If you use Linux, use a apt install Git or whatever. If you use Mac, there's versions for everyone. You can use like brew install Git or something. It comes default installed on a lot of operating systems too.
I think it's already in Linux. I don't know. I have Ubuntu, which
Yeah,
is Ubuntu. I think it's already there.
yeah,
In
exactly.
newer
And most of
versions.
them, I can install it by default. I think even Macs, I think, are installing it by default now. Windows will probably be the one you'll have to download it.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's not installed, like any package manager, download and install.
Yeah.
And there's nothing, it's just like a single binary too. So there's nothing all that interesting. It's not complicated to install Git. There's other things more complicated to install. So when you have Git installed, what you want to do is fork the repository. So in GitHub, I'm on a specific page. You can do it from any page, but on the top level, GitHub, WordPress, Gutenberg, you want to, over here is the fork. And so as I was saying earlier, fork is when you make a copy of this old repository and copy it to your own. I've already created a fork of it by doing the local edit, but I've also did one to test it. So I've already have a fork made. If you click that, it takes a second. I don't know what happens if I click it again. It might say you already have one. Yeah, it just switched me over to my fork. So I already had one created. And this is my local copy of Gutenberg now. So this is a copy I want to check out locally so I can make changes to it. I can't make changes to the WordPress copy of it. I have to make changes to my own. So to do that, it's called Git Clone. And I do everything on the command line. I know what I'm typing when I do that. I know what it's running. There are Git and GitHub clients that can do a lot of this stuff too. And it all works pretty much the same. You would clone a repository and it'll just give you a GUI. You'll need the URL, what repository you want to clone. And you'll say, it might say copy or clone. You would want to click, I want to clone a repository. It would ask you for a URL and you would put it in. I think in the GitHub client, it would just ask, you could probably just do this aspect of it, just the Marcus Kaz Gutenberg, because that uniquely defines a GitHub repository. So you would hit enter there and it will copy out the repository locally for you. I've already done that. It just creates a new directory called Gutenberg, and that's where I've already done here. So I have a local directory called Gutenberg, and I have all the files that are there. So then I can go into docs, and then I can see the changes in here, add the README, and then you can make any of the changes you want to make. Now this one was a copy from the WordPress master. So there's not a, that test change that I made is not here, right? So this was just what's in the top level of the WordPress source code. So if I wanted to do the same change, I can, oops, let me look at my notes first because I think I'm supposed to do one more step. Go to Gutenberg, click fork, clone it. So it's recommended to create a branch. This isn't necessary for local development when you're doing it on your own, but it is when you create them in the WordPress repository. So let me see if I can explain it. So a branch is just a separate set of changes you're going to make that you want to submit. So you can work in Gutenberg, all of the PRs are on their own branch, and then those branches kind of merge in. So the merge I did here for the other PR, it's on a branch called patch 2, and it's in my repository. That's who owns it. So this is the name of the branch. It's recommended, so if you look at other PRs, They'll create branches using a descriptive name. What are you doing? I'm adding, and then you have a description of what you're going to do. There's also like update, remove, and some other words. If you look at our, I'm sorry for the handbook and the contributor guide, it kind of gives you some ideas on the Git workflow, on add, try, update, on some things that you may, how you want to name it. We're not that strict overall on these names. It's useful, it's a good practice because you can kind of give a sense. So here I might create a branch. In Git, the way you create branches and stuff are, a new Git will use switch create. So I'm going to switch to, I'm going to create a branch and switch to it. I'm going to update test readme. So it creates a new branch. This says create this new branch and then switch to it. Git is a little confusing and a little complicated. It's worthwhile to read a couple of tutorials on how to use it. The basics aren't too bad, but some of the syntax gets a little bit weird, just the way it's kind of grown over time. So now I'm on this branch. I can make my change. Let's add my test. And now that changes on a branch. I can switch now. Actually, if I do Git status, it tells you exactly everything about what you're doing. So I've modified this file, but I've not committed it. And then Git will tell you how to commit things here too. So Git status is, I can run that a million times a day. So I've made my change there and I can commit it to my branch here. So git add readme. And then I want to add a message to it also. So adding it, this is where Git is. You say, let's do a status. They call it staging it also. So you say, hey, these are the set of changes. If I did like a bunch of changes, I want to just add them to one set of a commit. I can just keep modifying and editing and add them, and then they'll grow over time. And then I can say, okay, let's commit this set of files that are staged out. You can do an add and a commit in one step if you specify the file. So this is my useful commit message. And it'll add that file. So if I did a second change, I can do a commit. And if I just say second change, and I didn't do the add part first, but if I specify the file, it'll automatically do the add for me too. So that's another possibility. Now, all of these changes are locally on my local checkout and not up on the GitHub repository. If I switch branches, so if I switch back to the master branch, the change I had is not there, right? So that's why you can work in different branches and have different changes. So if I switch back to this branch and then look at that file, my changes are there. Everyone with me so far? Or any questions at the moment? All right, I will keep going. So I'm working locally. Let me look at my notes. All right, I created my branch, optional. I recommend creating a branch, but technically you don't have to do it because you can always work on your local copy master, but then when you push it up, it's just going to refer to it as master. So this is potentially optional. Made my change, I committed my change. Now I want to push up my change to my branch, right? So let's go here, and that command is just simply git push. Aha, it's saying I've not created this update test readme branch on my copy. That branch doesn't exist, so it tells you how to do it. So I want to shortcut -u. So I want to create that branch and push it up. Oops, I have a typo, I'm sorry. You have to match the branch name too. So this is going to push up, it's going to create a new branch upstream, which is what they call the branch that we copied from. And in ours, it's defaults to the name origin. This is a lot just happened. So the git push command is going to refer to what they call a remote. The remote is what it sounds like, a remote server, a remote GitHub, or a Git repository. GitHub just happens to be what everyone uses. You name it by default. So when I did that Git clone, wherever that command was, the Git clone command will automatically create your local copy. It'll create a remote. It'll default that name to origin because that says that's where the origin is from. And then it will copy all your files to that. It creates, you can list your remotes. If you do the command git remote v, ignore this second one because we'll talk about that. I prepped some stuff earlier. Initially, it would just be this origin one. So it's Marcus Kaz Gutenberg is the origin remote. So when I do a git push origin, it says take this branch, push it up to origin, and set it as a tracking branch. And so now if I look up here, it has created this new branch and it pushed up some changes. GitHub notices that I did that and it says, hey, you probably want to create a pull request. So if I browse to the repository, it says, hey, do you want to create a pull request? All this stuff too is saying the same thing. Hey, you pushed it up. Hey, you probably want to create a pull request. Here's a quick link to help you create that pull request. So if you can copy that link, or if you browse your repository, you can create that pull request. So when I create that pull request, GitHub will also look and say, hey, you're forked from WordPress Gutenberg. You probably want to push this change to the, to the main WordPress Gutenberg repository. And that's what it ends up creating. So that pull request, and it explains it here. It's saying, hey, this is your repository. This is your branch. And you want to push this change to this branch, the WordPress Gutenberg repository on that branch. And the master branch is the main one. Did that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so I made my change locally. I pushed it up to my my copy, and then GitHub knows the process basically and says when it sees a change on a new branch in your copy, hey, you probably want to create this fork. You want to probably create this PR because it's on your fork, push it up to the main one. You don't have to. You can ignore it. You can say, hey, I just want my own copy and I'm going to work over here and not push any changes up. But that's not the meeting we're doing. We're doing contributing to Gutenberg. So you want to create that PR. You click it. Second test, ignore this PR because I'm creating actual PRs and people will get noticed.
You're going to get ignored.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to try and do something new later and be like, oh, I'm ignoring all his tests. Just a test. And so again, you'd fill in like all your details on what you'd want to contribute and all those aspects of it. And keep in mind that this, for documentation and code, it's all the same kind of workflow. And so a lot of these questions do apply to code more, like the testing, that stuff. But a lot also does apply to, there's certain style guidelines you'll want to like kind of follow and stuff like that too. Overall, it's not too picky at all. And if you weren't sure what your change was, while you're creating the PR, you can look down and it'll show you what you're changing to make sure you're doing the right stuff. Because it looks like I picked up a change I had from previous when I was preparing the thing. So if you click create PR, it'll do the same thing. It'll create the PR on WordPress Gutenberg and it creates it in there. And then I'd sit here and I'd wait for this PR to get approved and then I can merge it. And it's going to run through all the tests and make sure that everything works as expected. You can look, when you're looking at a PR, you can see what files have changed and see the differences made. You can see the commits, which will give you the kind of the individual levels. So you can see what the comments are there and can see, okay, when you created this, see this one I created yesterday. And you can see the individual, like, okay, what were the comments or what were the changes? Is that me too?
No, this.
Okay. And so that is the second one. So the fork, edit local, you push it up and you create the kind of same PR process. And for the for the Git, all of this stuff is documented too. So this is a very standard if you're contributing to any GitHub project. The PR process is kind of the standard way to do it. So there's lots of different documentation that does cover the process and how to use Git and all those things. So this isn't anything new to WordPress or Gutenberg. It's just a fairly standard process. People do things a little bit different, but mostly this is how most things are. All right. The final one is it's the same as this fork and edit, but this one's only a little different because it requires when you add a new file to Gutenberg, and this is kind of specific to how we do documentation, a script needs to be run. So when a new file is added, let me walk through the process of our documentation a little bit. So I talked about it before. So in Gutenberg, there's a docs directory. In that docs directory are saying all these are all markdown files, and this gets published up to the block editor, the developer handbook here. The way it does that, it actually reads this manifest JSON file. This file you don't need to worry about because you don't edit that file. What we edit is this TOC file. It's a table of contents. And this file maps out exactly how all the documentation kind of fits. So if you look at this sidebar and this table of contents file, they match. So these are nested JSON. So at the top level is the README. There's going to be a principles file, which is this project overview. And inside of that will be these architecture files. So if we look inside of that, you'll see the architecture files. Inside of architecture is this nested file, which you'll see here, right? So we can change, without having to change any documents, we can change the table of contents, which changes the layout on the published view. So we can make the published view a little bit cleaner, a little bit nicer. We can move the tutorials up top, even though in the code they might be buried deep. So it gives us some abilities to organize it. And so when you add a new file, you do need to update this table of contents to say, where do you want this file to fit into the system? If you don't add it, it won't know. Did that make sense? So, and that maps to this table of contents here, right? So all these things will map to this. There's a couple of extras, which we don't need to discuss now. It's kind of more advanced, but for the reference, these get auto-generated from the packages. So these aren't edited directly in the markdown in the docs directory. There's a, in each of the packages, they have documentation. So if you do any package, and then in here is a README. So there's a script that will run through and generate that package reference. So then if I look in package reference, then it will have that file, and then that's that README here, shows up there. So that one's a slightly different one, and most of that's it for like code changes, but you might see in the components, you might see a typo, you might see something that's incorrect that needs fixing in those. So these reference ones are auto-generated outside of that docs directory. But most of them,
there is the button edit on every page, so you can easily find it.
That's exactly right. Thank you. So yeah, at the top, that's even easier. I should have done that instead of going to the GitHub. I don't know. I did that. Yeah, so even easier. Instead of finding it, you can just click up here and edit, and it will take you right to the page. And it actually takes you to the page opened exactly how you want, and say here,
ready for edit. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's that same process, that first process I told. a much easier way to get there. Thank you. So adding a file, let me get back to here and here. So you'll need to add it to your table of contents. And then a script runs that takes that table of contents and it generates this manifest file. I never even look at this manifest file. It's not, I think it just maps like the direct, like it goes through. So if you look in the table of contents, all this says is principles, principal MD, right? It's that file. But if you look in the block editor, it that file is actually called, here it's called project overview. So if you look in the file itself, it was, what was that file? Contributors, principles. And it's a README, almost all the, it's called project overview. So that script will go through each file, find the title of the file, and then populate it in the, that's what the manifest file is. So you can see it here. So it just populates all of those, comes through and gives it the final thing. All we have to worry about is the table of contents. So here. So if we're going to create a new file, let's say we want to do a new, we'll just do one at the top. I'm in docs already. And so if you do a new, the README should be in every directory. And then you can refer to it that way also. But so that README would be the contributors. Like the documentation, like any project, the Gutenberg project's now I think 3 years old. And so like, if we knew what we wanted at the very beginning, this would be a lot more organized.
Yeah.
So it's just life of a project. So you end up just kind of searching and finding where you want to do it. So like the principles is in contributors, but the architecture is in, you know, this architecture one's not under that. So it's not all perfectly organized. I'll just create a new file inside of here and we'll just add it there and do as a test. So in contributors, my test file. All right. Every file needs a title and you need to start a title in Markdown with a single hash. My test title. Here is my content. One. And then it's all of the Markdown in the documentation is just fairly standard Markdown. The one interesting thing is how to link within the handbook. And for that, you can go to the contributor guide and it does explain how to link things. Under documentation contributions, on the bottom of this page, it explains how to use links. So if you want to link to anything, you want to go back and you have to use the full path starting at /docs. So if I wanted to link to, sorry about that. So if I wanted to link to say this design document, I would have to go, this one's not that far away, but I have to go to /docs/contributors/design.md. Even though it's in the same directory I'm in, it doesn't work quite like that. So I think it was contributors design MD. So I'd have to go back into and it can get a little bit tedious when you're in like deep in a tutorial because you have to go back to the whole thing, but copy and paste and it works pretty well. So it's one of the like kind of the downsides in just the publishing. The thing to keep in mind, excuse me, is our documentation also gets published in here. You can browse it nicely in GitHub pretty well. It's not quite as nice, it's not as well organized, but you can browse in here and you can read GitHub or render any of the Markdown. So a lot of people just browse it in here and read it. And so that's why the links are a little more complicated. And then also like all of the node documentation, a lot of our Gutenberg stuff is browsable, like the packages and stuff are all in here. and then they all show up in this context also. And so that's why the links are a little more complex than we'd like, but they all end up working inside of that context also. So we kind of have 3 different ways you can browse. And then people will also just browse locally. I'm running a little low on time, so let's, when I add my file, there's my file. And then I'm going to do the same. I didn't create a new branch. Oh, look at that. You don't create a new branch, but I haven't added it. I can go back and still create it. So I can switch back to the master branch. My change is still there because it hasn't been committed anywhere. It's just sitting there. Then I can say, okay, let's create my new branch. If I can type, add docs, new file. And then I can come in and say my file is still there. And I can say add the file, adding a new file. So at this point, I could push this up, but it's going to give me it wouldn't give me an error actually, but it wouldn't publish it anywhere. So I have my new file. It's not linked anywhere. Since I haven't updated the table of contents, it won't link it anywhere. So I might make that new file, push it up, and then if I go to the block editor, let's say it all gets merged. If I go to the block editor handbook, it would not show up anywhere because it's not linked. So I'd have to update my table of contents. So let's update that. Let's put my new file here because it's the same spot. You're editing JSON, so you have to be careful with your commas. My test file. And then I also have to commit that file. So I can add it, update table of contents. So I add and commit in the same command. Now at this point, it's going to run through some tasks and it's going to generate, automatically it should change my manifest file. So to do this step, you need to have Node installed and it will all just work fine. So to do that, you need, the easiest way to do it, if you follow the developer guide, there's a tutorial here for setting up development environment. And I think we have links a couple other spots. So you'd want to set up the Node tool, so development tools. And I just use NVM is the easiest one to install. There's also installers. It's similar to Git. You can download for Windows or anything else. And I don't think anyone's quite, you go to node.js.org, they have downloads for everything. I don't think many OSs come default with it, like Git.
Yeah.
But it's pretty common. That's another one you can search. The Node version manager is usually pretty easy to install. If you're using Linux, Windows, WSL2, or Mac, this command will work and just install everything set up. We also have full instructions here, so you can go through that. So after I ran this, it generated this file, and this is where you might, if I push this up without committing this file, the PR request would give an error. It said, hey, you made a change, and this needs to get committed in. So I would just add the manifest file. I'm going to do it in 2 steps. Add manifest file. And then I have all these local changes committed but not pushed up because I haven't created that branch remotely. So I can create my branch on the origin. And I can push it up with that command. If I tried to do the git push, it would give me this command again. And then I can create a new PR here. And that would be my adding the new file PR. And then this one will have, it would go through the, to create the PR. And it will run through the test here. This is if I didn't add that manifest file, the test would fail at one of these points. And it runs a few more tests you can see than the other ones. If you just do just a markdown change, the amount of tests it runs is pretty small. The fact that I changed some JSON files, the tests end up running a few more. So then once those passed, commit, and it would go out. All right, I had one more. Any questions on that? This one's a little more complicated, but if you have Node installed, it's not too much more. It actually generated, ran this. I think it's a new step. If I ran this myself, it would have generated the manifest file, then I would have added it. When I committed this, it ran that step automatically and it generated the file, and then I committed. Then I pushed it up. The last thing was kind of the, as you're checking out things and making copies, you can get kind of fall behind what's happening on the master branch on the in the WordPress repository. So you want to keep your local copy, your fork, up to date. And to do that, what you want to do is, and again, you can search how to keep local Git fork up to date or something like that, and you'll get, it's a pretty standard process and everyone has to do this. What you want to do is you want to add the main Gutenberg repository as a remote locally. So I'm just going to call it upstream, and that's a common thing. So you say you call, because it's the upstream, this is my copy of it. And you can name these things anything you want, it doesn't matter. But the common things is your thing's called origin, the one upstream is called upstream. And then, so once I've added that, I have kind of two copies, and then you can switch around and do things, right? I can switch to an upstream branch, which is kind of weird. And so now, oops. Let's not play around. So let's look at my status. I'm on my own master. I'm tracking this. If I want to pull in a change, I want to update the upstream source, and then I mention what branch I want to update. I want to update the master branch. And this will go to the WordPress, pull down all the changes that have happened in the main one, and now I have a kind of copy of that here. It's not been applied anywhere, but it's just a copy of it, and it knows what the differences are. To apply it to mine, you do what's called a rebase. And you just say, I'm on my branch, I want to move my branch, which is what the rebase is kind of like. I want to move that to incorporate all the other changes. So you say, I want to move it based off of that. So then it would take any of the changes that are in this one, and it kind of puts my branch at the top of that. At this point, there can be conflicts if you've modified something in your branch that's not been modified, that also was modified here. And then you'll get some messages here, and you can adjust them. And then Git is pretty good about telling you what you should do. It can get a little bit complicated if there's a lot of changes and a lot of changes, but usually it's fairly straightforward to figure it out if there's a small set of changes. You can also just say, forget it. And if you use a GUI like the GitHub client, there's like buttons to say like, okay, just accept everything that they're doing, and I'll just redo my changes on top. And overall, it's not too bad, but. All right, any questions?
Nope.
Any other thoughts? Comments? Something
I like the most the first way to do things for documentation. I really hate forking and downloading, cloning, and making branches locally just for documentation. So I really love doing it directly there.
Yeah, I recommend if you can, if it's a small set of changes, even if a larger set of changes, you can do multiple files. Just use it, do it all in GitHub. and it can be a pretty good way to do it without having, it's only when you start adding files and some other things that it starts to get a little more complicated. But yeah, if it's just some fixes, some other things, just doing it all straight in GitHub is definitely the
Yeah,
way to go.
especially when you just find some error or something like that and you're in the middle of something, I really don't want to go through whole the
Yeah,
process.
okay, I have to do a fork on that. You kind of forget about it too, because I have my GitHub, my main account, MCAS account, has the permissions to create branches and all of that on the GitHub, on the WordPress repository. So that removes a couple of steps of complexity.
Yeah.
So like and
You're muted. Muted.
that's so weird. I wonder if my microphone's my headset's going out or something. Yeah, so
it gives you limits to talk.
just you said too many words. Stop.
Yeah.
Yeah, I say like you just kind of forget the complexity that's involved sometimes, like because you have like we have a certain level of permission, kind of beyond like a general contributor or a new contributor.
Yeah.
So great. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? Comments? I will post this up. Milana, I'll try and figure out like where to post it. I think I'm gonna upload it to YouTube because that's usually the easiest, and then you can share it maybe in a couple different spots. I'll embed it on mine, but I think I want to move it. I'll talk to the learn.wordpress.org people too. I know you wanted to do a couple of different documentation ones, so we can figure out where it goes once we get it all published and up.
Cool.
Thanks so much. Thanks all who could attend.
Thank you.
I'll chat with you all later.
For the time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
And then as always, find us.
Muted.
Fun.